The email arrived at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. Subject line: Federal Compliance Audit, Notice of Visit. I read it twice, my coffee going cold in my hand. The Department of Labor would be conducting an unannounced audit of our employment practices, starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. They'd be reviewing payroll records, employee classifications, overtime calculations, and contractor agreements for the past 3 years. Tomorrow morning. Less than 24 hours notice. I forwarded the email to my manager, David Chen, with a simple note. The audit I warned about in February, May, and August is happening tomorrow. We need to talk immediately. Then I opened the folder I'd been maintaining for the past 11 months. Compliance concerns. Documentation. 47 separate emails I'd sent, flagging issues. Detailed memos outlining problems. Meeting notes where I'd raised concerns that were dismissed. And my favorite document, the one I'd created after my 6th warning, was ignored. A spreadsheet showing exactly which violations we'd be dinged for and approximately how much each one would cost us in fines. I'd predicted this audit within a 2-month window. I'd told them exactly what problems the auditors would find. And I'd been ignored every single time because I was too cautious and didn't understand the business context. Tomorrow morning they were going to find out just how much my caution was worth. Before I tell you what happened when that audit team walked through our doors, you need to understand something. This isn't a story about someone who enjoyed watching their company fail. It's about what happens when expertise gets dismissed as paranoia, when warnings get labeled as negativity, and when protecting the company becomes seen as not being a team player. If you've ever raised concerns that were brushed off until it was too late, if you've ever been told you're worrying too much right before everything you worried about came true, stay with me. Because what my company was about to learn was that compliance isn't optional. Warnings aren't suggestions. And some people actually know what the hell they're talking about. My name is Jessica Morales, and I'd been the senior HR compliance specialist at Ridgeway Technologies for 6 years. I wasn't the head of HR. That was David's job. I was the person who made sure we didn't do stupid shit that would get us sued or fined or shut down by federal regulators. It wasn't a glamorous job. Nobody celebrates the compliance person who prevents disasters. You only get noticed when something goes wrong, and then it's your fault for not preventing it loudly enough. But I was good at my job. Really good. I knew employment law inside and out. I stayed current on regulatory changes. I understood which risks were acceptable and which ones were company killers. And I had a talent for seeing problems before they exploded. That talent had become a liability over the past year. It started 11 months ago when Ridgeway hired a new CFO, Marcus Webb. Marcus came from a startup background where move fast and break things was a virtue. He'd grown 2 previous companies rapidly and sold them for substantial exits. Our CEO, Jennifer Park, had brought him in specifically to accelerate growth and improve margins. Marcus's first initiative was to reclassify a bunch of our employees as independent contractors. On paper, it made sense from a cost perspective. Contractors don't get benefits, don't cost payroll taxes, don't require overtime pay. Converting 20 employees to contractors would save roughly $400,000 annually. There was just one problem. Most of those employees didn't meet the legal definition of independent contractors. I'd flagged this in my first meeting with Marcus. I understand the cost savings, but we need to be careful with worker classification. The DOL has specific tests for determining who qualifies as a contractor versus an employee. Most of these positions fail those tests because we control their work hours, provide their equipment, and they work exclusively for us. Marcus had waved off my concern. Jessica, I've done this at 2 previous companies. It's standard practice in tech. We just need to be smart about how we structure the contracts. Being smart about contracts doesn't change the underlying legal reality. If these workers are functioning as employees, calling them contractors doesn't protect us. Let me be direct, Marcus said, his smile tight. Your job is to help us execute business decisions, not to block growth with excessive caution. Find a way to make this work. I'd left that meeting and sent a detailed email outlining the legal risks, including citations to specific DOL guidance and case law. I estimated that if we were audited, The misclassification could cost us $800,000 to $1.20 million in back taxes, penalties, and fines. The email was acknowledged but ignored. 2 weeks later, 20 employees were reclassified as contractors. That was my first warning. There would be many more. In March, Marcus implemented a new policy for our sales team. Instead of paying overtime for hours worked beyond 40 per week, he created a commission adjustment system that he claimed exempted them from overtime requirements. I'd reviewed the policy and immediately seen the problem. Marcus, this doesn't actually meet the requirements for the commissioned employee exemption. The exemption requires that more than half their compensation comes from commissions. For most of our sales team, commissions are only about 30% of their total comp. We still owe them overtime. The policy clearly states their compensation is commission-based, Marcus replied. What the policy states doesn't matter if it doesn't reflect reality. The DOL looks at actual compensation structures, not what we call them in policy documents. Jessica, I'm not going to let compliance concerns prevent us from implementing competitive compensation structures. If you can't find a way to support business objectives, maybe we need someone in your role who can be more solution-oriented. That was the first time he'd openly questioned whether I should keep my job. It wouldn't be the last. I'd sent another detailed memo to David and Marcus, explaining why the commission structure didn't meet exemption requirements and estimating the exposure at $350,000 in unpaid overtime for the past year, plus penalties. David had called me into his office after receiving the memo. Jessica, I need you to understand something. Marcus is under pressure from Jennifer to hit specific margin targets. He's not trying to break the law. He's trying to build a sustainable business model. Building a sustainable business model doesn't include wage and hour violations. Can't you work with him to find compliant alternatives instead of just saying no to everything? I've proposed compliant alternatives in every memo. They cost more money, so they get ignored. I'm not saying no to growth. I'm saying don't grow by violating federal law. Your tone in these memos is becoming a problem. It reads as obstructionist. My tone is factual and professional. If facts about legal compliance read it as obstructionist, that's a different issue. David sighed. Just try to be more collaborative, okay? We're all on the same team here. I'd left his office knowing exactly what was happening. My warnings were being reframed as personality problems. My expertise was being characterized as inflexibility. And the legal exposure was growing every day. Over the following months, I continued documenting violations and sending warnings. Each time, the response was the same. My concerns were noted but not acted on. I was told to be less risk-averse and more solution-oriented. In June, Marcus eliminated paid sick leave for our contractor workforce, which would have been fine, except they weren't actually contractors. They were misclassified employees who now weren't getting legally required sick leave. In July, he implemented a policy requiring employees to work through lunch, but didn't adjust their paid hours. Unpaid work time is illegal. I sent a memo. It was ignored. In August, he started classifying some of RAT days. More unpaid overtime. More violations. More memos that went nowhere. By September, I'd flagged 47 separate compliance issues. I'd estimated the total exposure at over $3 million if we were audited. And I'd been told explicitly by David that my negativity was impacting team morale. That's when I made a decision. I started sending every warning, every concern, every documented violation to my personal email. Not to use against the company, but because I had a feeling that when this house of cards collapsed, people were going to start looking for someone to blame. And I wasn't going to be that person. I also did something else. I contacted an employment attorney off the record and asked what would happen if a current employee reported compliance violations to the Department of Labor. The attorney explained that reports could trigger audits, and that whistleblowers had certain protections under federal law. I didn't file a report. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to give the company every opportunity to fix these problems internally first. But I kept that attorney's number in my phone just in case. In late September, I requested a meeting with Jennifer Park directly, bypassing David and Marcus. Jennifer's assistant initially blocked the request, but I'd been persistent. This is about significant legal exposure that requires CEO attention. Jennifer had given me 30 minutes on a Friday afternoon. I'd come prepared with a comprehensive summary. 47 violations across 6 categories. Estimated financial exposure of $320 million. Timeline showing how many times I'd raised each issue. And a proposed remediation plan that would cost approximately $600,000 to implement, but would eliminate most of the risk. Jennifer had listened politely, reviewed my documentation, and then asked the question I'd been dreading. Has David seen all of this? Yes. I've sent detailed memos to both David and Marcus about every issue on this list. And what was their response? Generally, that I'm being too cautious and need to be more solution-oriented. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Jessica, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Let me talk to David and Marcus, and we'll figure out next steps. Jennifer, I need to be clear about something. These aren't theoretical risks. These are active violations of federal employment law. D. If we get audited, we're going to have serious problems. I understand. But I also need to balance legal caution with business growth. We can't be so risk-averse that we can't operate effectively. This isn't about risk aversion. These are clear violations with predictable consequences. I'm not asking us to be conservative. I'm asking us to be legal. I hear you. Let me discuss with the team and we'll follow up. That follow-up never came. Instead, 2 weeks later, I got a memo from David outlining my performance improvement plan. Areas needing improvement included excessive focus on compliance over business partnership, negative communication style, and resistance to innovative solutions. I was being put on a PIP for doing my job. I'd signed the PIP acknowledgement and immediately forwarded it to my personal email along with a detailed timeline showing that the PIP came exactly 2 weeks after I'd escalated concerns to the CEO. If they were planning to push me out, I was going to have documentation showing it was retaliation. But I didn't quit. And I didn't stop sending warnings. In October, I flagged that our employee handbook hadn't been updated to reflect California's new sick leave laws. Ignored. In early November, I warned that our background check process was potentially violating ban-the-box requirements. Ignored. On November 15th, I sent what would be my final pre-audit warning. A comprehensive memo to Jennifer, David, and Marcus. Subject line: urgent, likelihood of dull audit, and mitigation steps. The memo was blunt. Based on industry patterns and the volume of violations we currently have, I assess the probability of a Department of Labor audit within the next 90 days as high. If audited, we face estimated fines and penalties exceeding $3 million plus potential criminal liability for willful violations. I strongly recommend implementing the remediation plan I proposed in September. Marcus had replied within an hour. Jessica, your constant doom and gloom predictions are not helpful. We've been operating this way for over a year without issues. Please focus your energy on supporting growth initiatives rather than imagining worst-case scenarios. I'd printed that email and added it to my personal files. 3 weeks later, the audit notice arrived. When I walked into David's office at 8:15 a.m. that Tuesday, he was already on the phone with Marcus. They both looked stressed. Jennifer was on speakerphone. Jessica just arrived, David said. Jennifer, she's the one who sent all those compliance warnings, which you ignored, I added helpfully. Jennifer's voice came through the speaker, tight with stress. Jessica, what exactly are these auditors going to find? I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I'd maintained for months. Everything I warned you about. Misclassified contractors who should be employees. Unpaid overtime for sales staff who don't meet exemption requirements. Unpaid overtime for its staff who were incorrectly classified as exempt. Lunch breaks that were worked, but not paid. Sick leave violations for the contractor workforce. That's just the big stuff. How bad is this? Financial exposure of approximately $320 million based on my analysis. That includes back pay, penalties, interest, and fines. Could be higher depending on how aggressive the auditors are. The room went silent. Why didn't anyone tell me this was serious? Jennifer asked. I told you in September, I said, keeping my voice level. You said you'd discuss with David and Marcus. I never heard back. David and Marcus received 47 separate warnings from me over the past 11 months. I have documentation of every single one. Marcus finally spoke. Jessica's been overly pessimistic about compliance risks since I arrived. We've implemented standard industry practices, standard for companies that get audited and fined, I replied. Which is what's happening now. Can we fix any of this before tomorrow? Jennifer asked. I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. Not meaningfully. These are historical violations. The auditors are going to review 3 years of records. We can't unmisclassify workers retroactively. We can't unpay overtime we already denied. We're going to have to deal with whatever they find. What should we do? Be honest about what they'll find. Provide all requested documentation. Don't try to hide anything because that makes it worse. Cooperate fully. And get a labor attorney here tomorrow morning because you're going to need one. Marcus, get our employment attorney on the phone, Jennifer said. David, pull together all the documentation they're going to ask for. Jessica, I need you in every meeting with the auditors. You know our systems better than anyone. Actually, I said carefully, you should know that I'm on a performance improvement plan that specifically criticizes my excessive focus on compliance. Having me represent the company might raise questions about why the compliance officer was being disciplined while violations were occurring. Another silence. We'll address the PIP situation, Jennifer said finally. Right now I need you focused on getting through this audit with minimal damage. After the call ended, David looked at me. Did you report us to the dole? No, good hour. You're sure? Because the timing seems awfully convenient, right after you sent all those warnings. David, I didn't need to report anything. Companies like ours, with rapid growth and aggressive cost-cutting, get flagged by algorithms that detect high-risk patterns. We probably triggered a dozen red flags between the contractor reclassifications and the exemption changes. The dole doesn't need whistleblowers to find companies that are this sloppy. So this really is just bad luck? Bad luck would be getting audited despite trying to follow the rules. This is inevitable consequences of ignoring your compliance officer for 11 months. Marcus, who'd been quiet, finally spoke. You seem pretty calm for someone whose company is about to get hammered with fines. It's not my company, Marcus. I work here. And I've spent 11 months trying to prevent exactly this. You want me to panic now that my warnings turned out to be accurate? You could have been more persuasive. I sent 47 detailed memos with legal citations and financial impact estimates. What part of that wasn't persuasive? The part where I showed my work or the part where I quantified the costs? Your attitude is, gentlemen, Jennifer's voice came through the speaker, cutting off Marcus. This isn't the time. Jessica, thank you for your candor. Please prepare a summary of violations we should expect them to find. David, Marcus, start pulling documentation. Everyone's priorities just shifted to managing this audit. I spent the rest of that Tuesday doing what I'd been trying to do for 11 months, documenting our compliance failures. But this time, instead of hoping someone would listen, I was preparing for federal auditors who had subpoena power and didn't care about business justifications. By 6 p.m., I'd created a comprehensive summary. Contractor misclassification. 23 workers incorrectly classified as contractors when they should be employees. Estimated back taxes, benefits, and penalties. $1,400,000. Overtime violations, sales. 17 employees denied overtime pay based on invalid commission. Exemption. Estimated back pay and penalties, $425,000. Overtime violations, 12 employees incorrectly classified as exempt. Estimated back pay and penalties, $380,000. Meal break violations. Systematic failure to pay for worked meal periods. Estimated back pay and penalties, $270,000. Sick leave violations. Failure to provide required sick leave to misclassified contractors. Estimated penalties, $180,000. Record-keeping violations. Multiple failures to maintain required documentation. Estimated penalties, $150,000. Total estimated exposure, $2,805,000. I'd sent the summary to Jennifer, David, Marcus, and our employment attorney with a note. This is what I expect them to find. Actual penalties may be higher if they determine violations were willful rather than negligent. Our attorney Robert Kim called me at 7:15 p.m. Jessica, I've reviewed your summary. Is this really as bad as it looks? It's actually worse. This is just the clear violations. There are gray areas that could go either way, depending on how the auditors interpret things. How long have you been warning about these issues? 11 months. I have documentation. And the responses? Generally that I was being too cautious or not solution-oriented enough. I was put on a performance improvement plan in October for excessive focus on compliance. Robert was quiet for a moment. That's going to be a problem. For who? For the company. If it comes out that you were warning about violations and were disciplined for doing so, it suggests willful disregard. That escalates penalties significantly. I know. Did escalates penalties significantly. I know. Did. You report anything to the DOL? No. Would you testify truthfully if asked about your warnings? Of course. Okay. Here's what's going to happen tomorrow. Federal auditors are going to walk through that door and ask for 3 years of documentation. They're going to find everything you've outlined in this memo. Then they're going to ask who was responsible for compliance oversight. They're going to ask whether compliance concerns were raised internally. And at that point, this becomes a question of whether violations were mistakes or willful disregard. And my documentation makes it look willful. Your documentation proves it was willful. You gave them a roadmap of problems and they ignored it. That's the textbook definition of willful violation. So, what should I do? Tell the truth. You're not responsible for the decisions that were made. You're the one who tried to prevent this. Don't protect people who threw you under the bus. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what was going to happen when those auditors walked through our doors. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd been right about every warning. But another part of me felt sick about what this meant for my colleagues who had nothing to do with these decisions. The audit team arrived at 8:47 a.m. Wednesday morning. 3 DOL investigators with badges, laptops, and rolling cases full of documentation templates. They set up in our largest conference room and requested an initial meeting with executive leadership and the compliance team. Jennifer, David, Marcus, and I sat across from them while Robert Kim, our attorney, sat at the end of the table. The lead auditor, a woman named Patricia Guerrero, opened her laptop and started with the standard introduction. We're here to conduct a comprehensive audit of Ridgeway Technologies' employment practices for the past 3 years. This audit was triggered by algorithmic analysis identifying high-risk patterns in your payroll data and classification changes. So I'd been right. Not a whistleblower report. Just patterns that flagged us as non-compliant. We'll be reviewing worker classifications, wage and hour practices, record keeping, and various other employment standards. We'll need access to payroll systems, employee files, contractor agreements, and relevant personnel. Patricia looked directly at me. You're the compliance officer? Senior compliance specialist, yes. How long have you been in that role? 6 years? And your responsibilities include monitoring compliance with wage and hour laws? Yes. Have you identified any concerns about current practices? This was the moment. I could hedge, protect the company, try to minimize things. Or I could tell the truth. Yes. I've identified multiple concerns over the past 11 months and raised them with management repeatedly. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I saw her colleague make a note. Can you elaborate? I pulled out my laptop and opened my documentation folder. I have 47 documented warnings sent to management between January and November of this year. They cover contractor misclassification, overtime exemption errors, meal break violations, and record-keeping issues. And what was management's response to these warnings? Generally, that I was being too cautious or overly focused on compliance rather than business growth. Several of my warnings were acknowledged, but not acted on. Marcus shifted in his seat. Jennifer's face was carefully neutral. David looked like he wanted to disappear. Do you have copies of these warnings? Yes. All 47, with dates, recipients, and specific concerns raised. Patricia nodded. We'll need copies of all that documentation. It's going to be relevant to determining whether violations were negligent or willful. Robert Kim spoke up. The company is prepared to cooperate fully with the audit. We'd like to note that these were good faith business decisions made during a period of rapid growth. We'll take that into consideration, Patricia said. But if we find that a compliance officer repeatedly warned about violations and those warnings were ignored, that's going to significantly impact our findings. Over the next 3 days, the audit team systematically tore apart our employment practices. They reviewed contractor agreements and confirmed what I'd told management in January. These weren't legitimate contractors. They analyzed our sales compensation structure and confirmed what I'd warned in March. The commission exemption didn't apply. They examined overtime records for its staff and confirmed what I'd flagged in August. These weren't exempt employees. Every single thing I'd warned about was found to be a violation. And every single time when the auditors asked if concerns had been raised internally, the answer was yes. Jessica Morales, the compliance specialist, had warned about it. In writing. With specifics. On day 3, Patricia requested a private interview with me. Just me, no executives, no attorney. She was allowed to do this, and I couldn't refuse without making the company look worse. We sat in a small conference room, just the two of us. Jessica, I'm going to be direct with you. Your documentation has been extremely helpful in understanding the compliance landscape here. In fact, your warnings are some of the most thorough and well-researched internal compliance memos I've seen. Thank you. Then, which raises an obvious question. Why were you ignored? I took a breath. New CFO came in with aggressive cost-cutting target. My warnings about compliance costs were viewed as obstacles to growth. I was told repeatedly to be more solution-oriented and less risk-averse. Were there consequences for raising these concerns? I was put on a performance improvement plan in October. One of the criticisms was excessive focus on compliance over business partnership. Patricia made a note. Do you have documentation of the PIP? Yes. Can you provide a copy? Yes. She studied me for a moment. Jessica, you understand that what you're telling me suggests these violations were willful, not negligent. That significantly increases penalties. I understand. You also understand. You also understand that you're not protecting yourself or the company by being this forthcoming. You're actually making the situation worse for everyone. I'm telling the truth. That's my job. Your job as compliance officer is to protect the company from liability. My job as compliance officer is to ensure the company follows the law. I tried to do that for 11 months. I was ignored. Now you're here asking what happened, and I'm not going to lie about it. Patricia nodded slowly. Okay. Thank you for your honesty. The audit concluded on Friday afternoon. Patricia scheduled a final meeting with Jennifer, David, Marcus, Robert, and me to present preliminary findings. The numbers were worse than my estimates. $3,847,000 in back pay, penalties, taxes, and fines. The higher number came from the auditors determining that several violations were willful rather than negligent, which doubled or tripled certain penalties. The determination of willfulness, Patricia explained, is based on the fact that your compliance officer provided extensive documentation of violations over an 11-month period, and those violations continued despite clear warnings. This suggests deliberate disregard of legal requirements rather than inadvertent mistakes. Jennifer's face was pale. Is there any way to contest that determination? You can contest it through the appeals process. But I'll tell you that the documentation from Ms. Morales is going to be very persuasive to any hearing officer. She didn't just raise vague concerns. She cited specific laws, showed exactly how you were violating them, and estimated the financial exposure. Then you continued the practices anyway. Marcus finally spoke. Those warnings were based on an overly conservative interpretation of the law. Patricia turned to him. Mr. Webb, I've read Ms. Morales' warnings. They weren't conservative. They were correct. Every violation she flagged, we found. Every legal citation she provided was accurate. Every financial estimate was within reasonable range of our findings. She wasn't being overly cautious. She was doing her job properly. So what happens now? Jennifer asked. You have 30 days to respond to our findings. You can contest specific violations, provide additional context, or propose remediation plans. But I'll be honest with you, the pattern here is clear, and well documented. Unless there are significant factual errors in our findings, I'd recommend focusing on remediation rather than contestation. After the auditors left, The five of us sat in that conference room in silence. Finally, Jennifer spoke. Jessica, I owe you an apology. You were right about everything. I know, that's not helpful right now, Marcus snapped. Neither is pretending this wasn't predictable, I replied. I told you in November that we were likely to be audited within 90 days, and that exposure would exceed $3 million. I was off by about $800,000, and 2 weeks. That's how predictable this was. So what do you want? Congratulations for being right. I want you to acknowledge that compliance isn't optional, that warning from experts aren't negativity, and that solution-oriented doesn't mean ignoring legal requirements. But mostly I want my performance improvement plan withdrawn and an acknowledgement that I was put on it specifically for doing my job properly. Jennifer nodded. Done. The PIP is withdrawn. I'll put that in writing today. And, Marcus. I turned to the CFO, who'd ignored every warning. I want an acknowledgement that your cost-cutting initiatives violated federal law and cost the company nearly $4 million in fines and penalties. Marcus's jaw was tight. That's not going to happen. Then I'll be happy to provide that information to the board of directors when they ask how this happened. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you that I have a documentation of 11 months of warnings that were ignored, and the board is going to want to understand why. You can get ahead of that narrative, or you can let me explain it for you. Jennifer held up a hand. Enough. Marcus, you're going to work with Robert to prepare a board presentation explaining what happened. Jessica, you're going to help us understand what remediation steps we need to take to prevent this from happening again. David, you're going to figure out how we explain to employees why their paychecks are about to include back pay and why some of them are being reclassified. We're all going to focus on fixing this, not assigning blame. But blame was already assigned. The audit report made it clear. Management had willfully disregarded compliance warnings. The financial consequences were their responsibility. Over the next month, Ridgeway paid $3,847,000 to the Department of Labor. We reclassified 23 contractors as employees. We restructured our sales compensation to comply with overtime requirements. We corrected our IT staff classifications. We implemented new policies for meal breaks and sick leave. And we had a very uncomfortable board meeting, where Jennifer explained how this happened and what was being done to prevent it from happening again. Marcus Webb resigned during that meeting. The board didn't ask him to, but he knew he had to. Your CFO can't cost the company $4 million in avoidable penalties and keep his job. David Chen was demoted. He kept his HR title, but lost his management authority. A new VP of People was hired who reported directly to Jennifer, and I reported to her instead of David. My role expanded. I became the Director of Compliance and Risk Management, with a 30% salary increase and direct reporting line to Jennifer. My job was to identify compliance risks across the entire organization and to have actual authority to stop things that violated the law. The board also implemented a new policy. Anytime the compliance director raised a written concern, executive leadership had to respond in writing within 10 business days, with either remediation plans or documented reasoning for accepting the risk. No more. Ignored warnings. 3 months after the audit, Jennifer called me into her office. Jessica, I wanted to thank you for how you handled this situation. You could have quit when we ignored your warnings. You could have reported us to the DOL yourself. Instead, you documented everything and stayed professional even when we were treating you poorly. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I know. But I want you to understand something. We nearly destroyed this company by treating compliance as an obstacle instead of a critical function. We put business growth ahead of legal requirements. And we punished the person who was trying to protect us. That's not leadership. Hi. That's stupidity. What changed? We paid $4 billion to learn a lesson we could have learned by listening to you for free. That tends to clarify priorities. 6 months after the audit, I was sitting in my new office, reviewing a proposal from our operations team to expand into 3 new states. The proposal was well-researched and financially sound. It would also require us to comply with 3 different sets of state employment laws that we weren't currently set up to handle. I drafted a memo outlining the compliance requirements and estimated it would cost about $200,000 to implement the necessary systems and processes. I sent it to Jennifer, the CEO, and the head of operations. Within 3 days, I had a meeting scheduled to discuss implementation timeline, not pushback, not complaints about being too cautious. A meeting to figure out how to do this properly. Jennifer, I said at the start of the meeting, I want to acknowledge something. This is what collaboration actually looks like. You're not ignoring compliance concerns or telling me to be more solution-oriented. You're asking how to achieve business objectives while following the law. This is what I was asking for the entire time. We learned the expensive way, Jennifer replied. But we learned. Now let's figure out how to expand without getting ourselves audited again. A year after the audit, I was invited to speak at an HR compliance conference about building effective compliance programs. Standing at that podium, looking at 300 HR and compliance professionals, I told a version of my story. Not to shame Ridgeway, though I was careful not to hide what had happened, but to illustrate what happens when companies treat compliance as an obstacle instead of a function. The most expensive words in business, I said, are "we'll worry about that later." Because later always comes. Sometimes it comes in the form of a lawsuit. Sometimes it's a regulatory audit. Sometimes it's a scandal that destroys your brand. But it always comes. I clicked to my next slide. I sent 47 warnings over 11 months. Every single one was accurate. Every single one was ignored. Why continue one stand. Company paid nearly $4 million to learn that compliance officers aren't being negative when we raise concerns. We're doing our jobs. After the presentation, a young woman approached me nervously. She was maybe 27, wearing a name tag that said compliance analyst. Jessica, I'm in a similar situation. I keep raising concerns about worker classification at my company and being told I'm too risk averse. What should I do? I pulled out my business card. First, document everything. Every warning you send, save it to your personal email. Every response or non-response, document it. Second, put your concerns in writing with specific legal citations and estimated financial impact. Make it clear you're not just worrying, you're identifying actual violations. Third, know that you might need to be willing to watch them fail in order to prove you were right. That feels like I'm hoping for my company to fail. You're not hoping for failure. You're recognizing that some people only learn through consequences. Your job isn't to prevent all failure. Your job is to provide clear warnings so that when failure happens, it's not your responsibility. What if they fire me for raising concerns? Then they've given you a retaliation claim. But more importantly, you've done your job properly. You can't control whether leadership listens to you. You can only control whether you warned them clearly and documented that you did. She nodded slowly. Thank you. It's good to know I'm not crazy for thinking this matters. You're not crazy. Compliance matters. Legal requirements aren't suggestions. And the people who understand that aren't negative, they're professional. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I want you to understand something. This isn't about celebrating when companies fail. It's about recognizing that expertise matters, that warnings matter, and that people who raise concerns aren't obstacles. They're protectors. Ridgeway Technologies didn't fail. We paid a painful penalty, we learned an expensive lesson, but we survived. And we built a better compliance culture because of it. But it required losing $4 million to teach leadership that my warnings weren't hypothetical risks, they were documented realities. If you've ever been told you're too cautious, too negative, too focused on risks, I want you to know something. You're probably right. And when the audit comes, when the lawsuit hits, when the scandal breaks, people are going to wish they'd listened to you when it was free, instead of learning when it cost millions. If this resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share your own experiences in the comments with warning people who were ignored until it was too late. Your stories validate others who are going through the same thing. Remember, compliance isn't negativity. Risk management isn't pessimism. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is document your warnings so that when consequences arrive, everyone knows you tried to prevent them. Even if nobody was listening at the time.